All right, class. So welcome to week 6 of the semester. We are in lab 6, which is the skeletal system. This week's lab is pretty simple, and there's not really a lab guide to it. I think on your Canvas, the lab guide just gives you the PDF version of the same document that's for your lab worksheet. So there's not really a lab guide for this week's lab. It's just kind of working through this worksheet. The learning outcomes of this week's lab are to identify, describe the function of the skeletal system, differentiate between the axial and appendicular, look at the bones of the skull, a typical long bone parts, identify the regions of the vertebral column, and then apply some knowledge of basic anatomy and physiology through some laboratory investigation. So this is what we'll be going over in this week's lab. If you just joined us, there's no lab guide that takes you through this because basically you read through the introduction in the worksheet and then do a lot of filling out of bones and parts of the skeletal system using your textbook or other resources. I'm assuming you guys have started the skeletal system in lecture, or maybe you've passed it already. But the skeletal system has several important functions in the body. In addition to providing levers and support for movement, it helps to support, so the bones form a structure for attachment of your skeletal muscles and support of soft organs. Your bones help with movement, so your bones provide leverage for muscles to change the amount and direction of muscle force during movement. So your muscles will contract, and that contraction pulls on the bones and allows your bones to move. Your skeletal system is very important with protection. So bones are hard and protect soft organs, such as the bones of your skull protecting the brain. Thanks, Yvonne. Thanks for letting me know. So some of you guys did this in your lecture. So hopefully this will be a review or just building on that. Your skeletal system forms your blood cells, red blood cells, white blood cells, and platelets. And then your bones also help with mineral and fat storage. So then in the different activities that follow, you'll be going through the axial skeleton, the appendicular skeleton, and you'll be labeling a lot of these bones. And it gives you in the worksheet the different bones that you need to label for each picture. And again, you can use your textbook, you can use any resource you have to label these bones, and you can see them here, the ones that are labeled. So this is looking at the axial skeleton. So you'll label the bones of the axial skeleton, and then you'll label these bones of the appendicular skeleton. The axial skeleton is the like skull bones and axial kind of core. And then the appendicular bones are all of the bones of the appendages. So the bones that make up your arms and legs, the pelvic and coxal hip girdle. Then you'll identify more bones of the human skeleton. So basically it's pointing at a bone and you'll have to identify it. On the left, you need to identify the region of the spinal column. So it's going to be cervical, thoracic, or lumbar for these different regions. And then I think everything points to the bones pretty clearly. There is a PDF version, again, under the lab guide that I listed in your Canvas, but I think pretty much a lot of this is self-explanatory for labeling the different parts of the skeleton for for this quiz. Next week, you can probably expect to have quiz questions all based on identifying different bones of the body and the only bones that you are covering in this lab. So I won't pull out any random bone that you didn't cover in lab. I'll use the bones that are covered here in this lab worksheet to test you guys on identifying them. Here are the bones of the skull, and I think it gives you the following to help you label them. This labeling is pretty good. There's a couple that are a little tricky. Number 6, so this one in purple, it's pointing to the sphenoid bone because the sphenoid bone actually sits behind your nose, and this little piece in pink or purple is the only part of the sphenoid bone that you can see from the surface of the skull. It's kind of where your temples are. The only other ones that are a little tricky are in here. I think number 4 and 5. Number 3 is the nasal bone, but then 4 and 5, one is the ethmoid bone and one is the lacrimal bone. I think 4 is the ethmoid bone and 5 is the lacrimal bone, but just those ones are kind of tricky to see. They're kind of labeled together. So just when you're labeling those, I'll be lenient on labeling for those, but make sure you know the difference between the ethmoid and the lacrimal bone, which one is more in the front and which one's more in the back. Yeah, so you would see like matching and labeling questions, probably a matching question. So I would probably show a picture with letters or numbers, and then you guys would have to match the correct bone name for the quiz. That's what you could expect for the quiz next week. So more of these. Again, I don't like how 6 and, well, I guess here it's a little clearer. So number 8, the ethmoid bone sticks out in the nose. So number 8 would be the ethmoid bone as seen there. And number 6 is the lacrimal bone. So again, those are kind of the two tricky ones. The other ones that are labeled should be pretty easy to see. Number 5 is pointing at the sphenoid bone again, because you can see the sphenoid bone making up the back of the eye socket and also kind of sticking out here on the temple region. The other bones you should be able to label there a little clearly. So I'll let you guys work through that, the bones of the skull. The bones of the vertebral column, then, you have to tell me the region name and then the number of vertebra in each region. So an easy way to remember this, and I'm kind of telling you all the answers, but the cervical region has 7 vertebrae. So here's cervical, and that has 7. The thoracic region has 12, and then the lumbar region has 5. And again, you guys should know that for the quiz, but a professor once told me once, an easy way to remember this is you eat breakfast at 7, you eat lunch at 12, and you eat supper at 5. So that might help you remember the number of vertebra in each of those regions. And then I'll let you look at the number of vertebra in the sacral and coccygeal. And then next activity is the structure of a long bone. So this is the typical structure of a long bone, the different parts of it. The ends of the bones are called the epiphysis. You have a distal and proximal end. Remember, the proximal end will be closest to the point of attachment. The distal end will be further away. You have medullary cavities in the middle, periosteums. Red bone marrow will be in red. Yellow bone marrow will be yellow. And then spongy bone will usually be found in this area. So, red bone marrow, spongy bone, I think they're kind of pointed at two of the same. So I would accept either of these for red bone marrow or spongy bone because they're kind of pointed at the same thing. What this is pointing at is this little white line, and that's called the epiphyseal plate or growth plate where the bone grows. So I'll let you guys label these parts of the long bone. And again, they give you all the words that you should use right there. So you might expect a picture of a long bone on your next quiz too. Let's see. So this is where people are running into problems. I don't believe this link works anymore. It says maybe some of it would work for some of you, but I couldn't get it to work on my end. If you can, that's great. But if you cannot, you can skip procedure A under activity 6. These are practicing what you've learned in labeling. What I'm hoping will work, and it did work on my end, was procedure B. It's the anatomy arcade, and it's the whack a bone. And it basically has you quickly identify bones really, really fast. And I'll show you, I'll just pull up this link. And I think, hopefully you guys are seeing this. So here's the whack a bone link. It should pull up, and then you can go ahead and it has fun sounds. And then you can play the game. And what it actually has you do is kind of identify bones in under 60 seconds, and then you start it, and then metatarsals, I didn't even get those right. Metatarsals, they're in the feet. So this takes you through, it's kind of a fun game of just identifying, practicing what you just learned. There was someone who had an issue eventually in that whack-a-bone. They were having some problems further down. So I would do the whack a bone as long as you can, just as a practice of what you just learned with the skeletal system. But that's all you need to do for this week's worksheet. Fill out basically all these labeling pages, submit it. Again, if you are working in a group, just a reminder to put all of your names on the worksheet. And if you do, for some reason, get a 0, just email me and let me know the group that you worked with. And I think that's it. So I'll go ahead and stop the the recording. Remember to do the quiz from last week's lab. That'll be open tomorrow. And this worksheet due on Sunday night. I hope you guys are doing well and keep up the great work.